go. Right, so now we're into Substance. Let's import that little wall panel that we just made. So remember, in Substance, it doesn't actually say import, remember. It just says new, which again can be a bit confusing because you might think, is this it? Import resources? But no, it's new. Then it comes up with our new project. So the template we want, well, this is the one we want. We want PBR metallic roughness. So be very careful because all the, well, in rare cases you might want these two, but you definitely don't want any of the other ones. PBR metallic roughness algorithmic. Click that, make sure that's there, and then you go to File, Select. This is where you select your model. So this is my wall panel. So I just click that. I don't need to check anything else. Last week, I think at least one person accidentally thought they added their stuff using this add button. So remember, just forget about that. Don't need that. Don't need anything else. The only other thing you might possibly want to change is the document resolution. But as I also mentioned last week, the brilliant thing about Substance is that it really doesn't matter what your document resolution is, because you can export your textures at higher or lower resolutions, and everything will scale perfectly, and it won't get, no detail will be lost. It's very, very clever the way it does that. So I'm not going to change that. So all I'm going to do is make sure that this is set to metallic roughness, PBR metallic roughness, and that I've got my wall panel selected in this part, and I'm going to go OK. And after not too much time, there's my wall panel. So I can look at this, and the good thing is it looks exactly like it looks in Maya. So all the smoothness has come across. Now, I'm going to introduce you now to a feature of Substance that is the, well, it's the game changer. It's the thing that makes Substance particularly powerful. Is that what Substance can do is it can take your object and it can then make, it can look at your object very, very carefully, and it can calculate a whole bunch of things. It can calculate where the occlusion shadows would be naturally. Now, ambient occlusion, I imagine quite a few of you know what ambient occlusion is, or have some idea of what it is. Ambient occlusion is where all the soft little occluded shadows would happen. So imagine if like your object was surrounded by an all-encompassing white light. There would still be certain areas of the object that would sort of self-shadow and get little soft little shadows happening. And that's what occlusion is. So it can figure out that. It can also figure out the curvature of your entire object. It can analyze every part of it and make a texture map that has the information of where it's super curved and where it's super sharp. It can also work out where in 3D space the pixels are that make up this object, and where in object space the pixels are. It can also work out how thick the object is. It can basically do a whole bunch of these kind of calculations, generate texture maps, and then use those texture maps in these things here called smart materials and smart masks. This is what makes, again, Substance so powerful, is that it can use all those texture maps to figure out automatically where the rust should go, where the dust should go, where paint would be peeling off, where things would be more worn. And it can do all of that kind of automatically, and you can then tweak it with just some sliders saying more rust, less rust, that kind of thing. So it's very, very useful. But we have to actually tell Substance Painter that we do want to do that on our object. It doesn't come in automatically doing that. And the way we tell it to do that is we go to this Texture Set Settings tab. So by default, you look at Layers, which is just like Photoshop. But if you go into this tab here, you can see the channels, the base channels we're going to use, which is color, height, roughness, metallic, normal. A bunch of other interesting stuff. But what we're looking for here is the mesh maps and bake mesh maps. So I just have to click that button, and notice at the moment these, I've got nothing in them. They just got select normal maps, select world space, etc, etc, etc. But if we go to bake mesh maps, we can tell it to analyze and bake those maps. Now, we don't need everything here. We don't need normal, and we don't need ID. I'm going to get into ID maybe next week or the week after, because it can be very, very useful, and you'll see in a way why it can be useful when I go through this, because I'm going to run into some slightly tedious selection problems, but an ID map can make that a lot easier. We don't need the normal because we're not going to be doing a high resolution to low resolution bake, as they call it. One of the other things that Substance can do, and this is more geared towards working on games, is that you can model and texture an incredibly highly detailed object, but then you can take all that information and transfer it onto a much, much lower resolution object, or you can make the textures work and make it look like the high resolution object, because it'll be doing lots of tricks behind the scenes on a low res object. But again, that's more for games, so we don't have to worry about that so much. Games people have to worry about it. Well, it's their bread and butter. They have to do lots of that, but we don't have to. So you can click off normal, you can click off ID, but you can leave everything else the same. You can specify the size of these maps, which actually, in this case, can actually make a difference. You got all the options. I would not go, to be honest, I would not go above 204A. I certainly wouldn't. If you do these, you're going to be sitting around forever waiting for it to work. I'm going to keep it at 1024 for the today's session, and I'm not going to change anything else. I'm just going to go bake Lambert 1 mesh maps, and it's called Lambert 1 because the material in Maya that's applied to it at the moment is the default Lambert material, which is called Lambert 1. That's where Substance gets its name, but don't worry, that's all that is a name. It's got nothing to do with how it's going to actually look. So I'm going to go bake Lambert 1 mesh maps. So it shouldn't take too long. You can automatically see there a little bit of occlusion just sort of popped in. And now also you can see that it's populated a bunch of these with the world space ambient occlusion. We can look at those maps by pressing, I think it's B. So this is the world space normal. If you keep on tapping B, it cycles through these maps. World space normal tells you what direction each pixel is facing. We don't have an ID map, so it just shows a checkerboard. There's our ambient occlusion map. So you can see those soft little occlusion shadows. Tap B again. There's our curvature map. So you can see it's put like a thicker, whiter line where there are harder edges sloping around that way, and then a darker line when it slopes around that way. This allows, the curvature map is brilliant for Substance figuring out where, as you hope maybe you can imagine, where worn edges on things are going to occur. And this is our position. There's world position and then there's also object position. They're very similar. This one can be quite good because, as you can see, it kind of smoothly gradients up through the whole object. So Substance can use that map to, say, determine how far down rust should drip, or how far down dust should be placed on an object. And yeah, you can keep on going through tapping B, and if you want to go back to your actual material, you just tap M for material, M for material. Right, let's start building some nice materials on this. So I'm going to go back to layers. I'm going to have a swig of water. Now I want a whole range of materials over different parts of this object. I want this part of the wall to be a different material than these parts and the bits in between. And I'll be showing you how you do that. An ID map would make this easier, but we'll get into that next week. For now, I just want to talk about making the materials. So I'm going to start off with the main wall. I'm going to build this material kind of from scratch. I don't need that layer because it's an empty layer. What I want is a fill layer. So I'm going to create a fill layer, and I'm actually going to name it straight away because I don't want to get lost. I'm going to call this Paint Rough. And if I scroll down here, I can see what this fill layer's got at the moment. And at the moment, it's got color, height, roughness, metal, and normalness. All I want, though, is color and roughness. So I'm going to unclick height, metal, and normal. So I don't have to worry about anything other than my color and the roughness. So I'm going to go into color, and the first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to give it a slightly off-white or bluish grey, something like that maybe. That's going to be my color, and I'm going to have a look. I'm going to mess around with my roughness. I want it to be quite rough. So as I move this roughness slider up, look at what happens to the highlight. Becomes a matte, rough kind of surface. As I move it down to nothing, it almost becomes a mirror or a super shiny plastic. But I want this to be rough, so I'm going to pull this roughness slider up a fair bit, like that. But what I'm going to try and create here is I'm going to try and create slightly dirty paint. And a paint surface to look interesting is going to have some parts of the surface are going to be rougher and glossier than other parts of the surface. So I'm going to create two paint layers. One's going to be rough and one's going to be glossy, and then I'm going to mix between the two to create that look. So I've created my rough, so I'm going to duplicate this, might as well. I'm going to call this one glossy. Now this one's sitting dead on top of paint rough, so I can't see paint rough at all. So I make this glossy, it's completely going over the top of rough. I can't see the rough. I'd have to hide that glossy by clicking this little button for me to see the roughness, the rough version underneath. But it's got the same color though, which is good, but I just want it to be glossier. So but I don't want it to be too glossy. I don't want it to be like a mirror. And I do want the color to be like just a tad darker. So I'm just going to pull that down a little bit, and I'm just going to shift the hue by a tiny amount. It's just these subtle little touches that's going to make your materials look more realistic. And I'm only dealing with color and roughness, so it's not overly complicated. Now I want to blend between the two to make it look like some bits of this wall panel are glossy and some bits are rough. So I need a mask to do that, just like Photoshop layer masks. So I'm going to right mouse button click and go add black mask. So instantly the glossy disappears because it's black in here, so nothing of this layer shows. If I painted white into here, which I've got by default, I've got a brush painting white, you can see I'm painting like a shiny version. You can see the shiny version showing through now. I'm going to undo that. But I'm going to use a procedural texture, and Substance comes with loads and loads and loads of these. With my mask selected, so I know it's selected because it's got highlighted in blue, I'm going to right mouse button and just add a fill. Now the fill layer lets me, at the moment, it's by default filled it with grey. So it's half showing the glossy going through. So there's a bit of glossiness. But I want to fill this grey layer with like a kind of grungy kind of map. And as I said, Substance comes with just loads and loads and loads of these. And to get access to these, you can either find them in here, or you can just directly click this grayscale sort of bar here. And this will bring up the browser for textures. And these, it will filter for procedural and texture by default. There's just too many though. So what I can do is I can type grunge. So now it's filtering out only the grunge maps. And as I hover over each one, you can get a little preview. Now these are procedural grunge maps. And what I mean by procedural is, to a certain extent, they are mathematically calculated. The advantages that that gives is that they also tile perfectly. So you can shrink or expand the scale of these textures, and they'll tile. You can keep on doing that. So you can get it really small detail covering the entire object, and they tile perfectly. Right. So let's choose a good grunge texture that maybe looks like a sort of dirty surface, but I want some contrast. Some excellent ones there, like fingerprints and stuff like that. It's really useful. Sometimes I'm going to spend ages just getting lost which one to use. Let's use something nice and contrasty. Let's use this one here, Concrete Old. Now, I don't know, it's kind of fairly subtle. I'll try and expand the viewport. And I'll also change the light as well. What it's done now is it's applied this mask now looks like this. So if I hold down Alt and click the mask, that's what it's applied all over it. If I click out of it. But now that's blending between the glossy and the rough version of the paint. And you can kind of see that if I catch a highlight. If I hold down Shift and then the right mouse button and move it back and forth, I can change the kind of light position. But now I can see the detail happening across that surface. You see that? How that looks a lot more interesting and realistic than when this map was not applied. That's how it looks like by default. That's what it looks like with the grunge map being used to blend between paint rough and paint glossy. It just looks a lot nicer. So this is the rough gist of building up textures. I mentioned it briefly last week. You've got to almost think literally in layers. You've got to think, what is my object literally made of? I will try and make that texture first. What sits on top of that object? Is it paint? Okay, now I'll make the paint. Now what sits on top of the paint? Will it be some dust? Will it be some dirt or grease or whatever like that? I'll make that, and you build it up layer by layer. I'll continue here. One thing I will do on my concrete grunge map is I will change the UV projection to triplanar, and that should get rid of a nasty seam that's happening at the top there. Right, so I've done the paint. Let's have some dust sitting on top of this thing. So I'm going to do another layer. I'm going to call this one dust. And again, I only want color and roughness. I don't want height, metal, or normalness. I'm going to go into the color. I'm going to figure out my dust. So my dust is going to be sort of, I guess, a sort of yellowy, muddy kind of, but also at the same time fairly light, kind of browny yellow kind of thing. So I'm going to do that. But dust obviously is going to be super rough. So I'm going to pull that up almost to the maximum. So it looks really rough. Sort of chalky kind of surface to it like that. So I want to decide where am I going to put that dust. I'm going to use one of the smart masks. Now these are masks that sit just here. They're not color. All they are used for is to blend between two different layers. And all of these smart masks use these texture maps that we generated when we did bake mesh maps. These smart masks cleverly decide where to put this layer. So you can just drag and drop them. So you've got a whole bunch of different dusts that come with substance. I'm going to go. You might need to try a couple before you find the right one. Let's try dust occlusion. Actually, let's try dust soft 2 first, because that looks quite nice. So I'm just going to drag and drop that onto my dust layer. Now it looks like the dust has gone, has vanished straight away. It's actually just really subtle. I mean, part of this is about being subtle. If I hide and unhide the dust, you can see that it's collecting more dust in the corners, and it's laying a bit of dust on top of the surface. We can see what that map looks like by holding down Alt and clicking the mask. So it looks like that. So actually sometimes this can be a good way of adjusting the mask, because now I can go to the mask editor and tweak some of these settings. Now there's a lot of settings in these mask editors. It can be a bit intimidating, but the best thing to do though is to just fiddle around with it, play with it. So let's try messing around. Let's see what happens with the position gradient. Nothing, because it's not really using that. What about world space normal? Not using that either. Curvature. Okay, curvature controls. It's kind of an overall dimming kind of effect. I imagine ambient occlusion. If you can, I'm pointing at the screen. You can't see it, but you can see it kind of darken just there. And you can just fiddle around with a bunch of these different things. Global balance tends to be a kind of just how much you're bringing on. So I'm going to bring in maybe that much, like that. And I might put a levels on this just to accentuate it. Just as in Photoshop, you can apply level kind of layers. So I'm going to put let me think. I'm going to apply and add levels. So if I put a levels on top of that mask editor, I can tweak around and fiddle around all the details in the mask editor to get the dust where I want it to be, but then I can use levels on top to kind of increase the contrast of that. If I click back onto here, you can see the dust collecting a little bit more obviously at the corners. So without. So instantly, I say instantly, within a few minutes, you're getting a material that again just looks more and more plausible, more and more realistic. I want to do one more thing to this before I start rushing through the rest, because I don't want it to take too long. Let's put some paint on there, but let's put some paint that spells something, right? So this time I want another fill layer. I'm going to make a kind of red glossy paint out of this. I don't want metalness and I don't want normalness, but I am going to keep height in this case because I want the paint to literally look like it's physically sort of sitting a little bit on top of what I've done already. So I'm going to make it nice and bright and red, and I'm going to make it fairly shiny like that. That's going to be my paint. Now if I was spending more time, I might do exactly like I did earlier on and make 2 layers of paint, one slightly shinier than the other. The more you do that, just the more realistic, the more rich that texture is going to look. I'm just going to call this paint. But for now, I'm just going to have 1 layer of paint. Again, I want a mask. I want a black mask, so my paint instantly disappears. But now I want to paint something on there. Now, again, Substance comes with these things called alphas, which some of these are procedurally generated, so they'll have little sliders on them, and some of them aren't. Some of them come just as they are. But they also, alphas come as fonts as well. Now you can use these literally as if you're a graffiti artist. Yeah, this is how to be a graffiti artist. You literally use a stencil in the mask to get the paint on. Let me show you what I mean by that. So as we scroll down in the mask, you can see a bunch of settings here. I'm just going to actually add a paint layer to the mask. So I'm just separating out whatever I paint into this actual little sub layer of the mask. Now in the paint sub level, there's this thing called stencil. If you drag and drop an alpha, anything black and white, into stencil, it's going to allow you literally use it like a stencil. So let's just choose a nice font, something that feels fitting. I'm going to use that one, Black Ops. So I'm going to drag and drop it into stencil. And now you can see the stencil sitting on top of the object, as if you were holding it up in front of your face constantly as you move closer and further away to the object. This is how you position your stencils. It feels a bit weird because you're not moving the stencil, it's just remaining static. You're just changing your camera to position the stencil. And when you do things like this, certainly with words, with fonts and stuff, you probably don't want to be in what's called perspective mode, which is a bit like perspective mode in Maya. But perspective mode means you get sort of this slight distortion, vanishing points happening. You can switch it to orthographic view, which feels a bit weird. Feels like a kind of isometric, turn-based kind of RPG kind of thing kind of going on, which is going to be better when you want to put on things like words because you're not going to get the distortion. But I do want to line this up perfectly with the front. So what I can do is I can get close to rotating around to the front, and then I can hold shift and it will snap me to this kind of front on view. If I do it on the side and then I hold shift, it snaps me to that view, and the same from the top. When you start using ZBrush next year in earnest, you'll be using this a lot. So I'm going to use shift to snap this on. Now I'm going to zoom in and decide where I want my text to go. So I want my text to go maybe just here. And I'm actually going to call it something else. I'm going to call it Ant Tech. I'm going to decide where I want to put it. And now this isn't a mask. I'm only painting with white here. I'm not painting with anything else. But I'm going to because I'm painting white, that red paint layer is going to show through. So let me just show you what happens when I paint white. The stencil disappears and that paint starts to show through. And then when I let go of the left mouse button, the stencil reappears. So I can just turn that off. I can get rid of that stencil by getting rid of that little X. So now I've got Ant Tech. I'm going to switch back to perspective viewport. That, and because the paint's got its own roughness, that shines slightly differently as well. Now I gave myself a height layer on this paint layer, so I'm going to go back to the paint, and if I shift this little height slider up, it actually makes it look like the paint's slightly embossed on top of the surface of the paint. So there we go. Now though, I only want this to happen on this central panel. So what I'm going to do now, a bit like Photoshop, I'm going to create a group, a folder here, and I'm going to move each of my layers into this group, into this folder. One there, one there, one there, one there. So now they're all sitting in this folder. So if I close the folder, I can't see my layers anymore. So I'm going to double click this folder and call it main panel. And I'm going to apply a mask to the folder. And it's going to be a black mask. So everything disappears now because nothing in this folder is actually showing. So what I want to do is define, I want to paint into this mask only this central section. I'm going to go to orthographic, make sure I'm snapped, and I'm going to put symmetry on, which is going to make this a lot easier as well. Now into this mask here, I'm going to put a paint, and in this paint, I'm going to paint where I want that main panel stuff to go. But I'm not going to paint with a brush. I'm going to actually select the polygons that I want this to go on. And what you have to do to get to that is to get to this bit here, polygon fill. When you click that, you'll see the wireframe of your object. And now instead of painting with a brush, you're selecting the polygons you want to go into that mask. And this is the value that when you select a polygon, you're either giving it a black value, a white value, or somewhere in between. I just either want it nothing or everything. So with it set to 1 and polygon fill, and you can select between triangular polygons, normal polygons, mesh fill, or UV chunks as well. But they're all different things. We're just going to stick with polygon fill for now. Now if I drag a rectangle around where I want those layers to go, it appears like that. Because I've got mirror on, symmetry on, I only have to do it to one side, which is super useful. Now you're probably going to miss stuff, and this is where it can get very tedious. And this is where an ID map would be better. I'm going to be super loose and rough. Thankfully, I'm only having to do this to this side because, yeah, it's mirroring everything on the other side. I'm going to get rid of this one. This one's a bit too much. I'm going to bring it down to nothing. And just select those. I might have to do that all the way down. I'm not going to bother doing that. Do a real sloppy job. Something like that. Okay, that's enough. I'm not going to do any more. So now, if I switch symmetry off and I go back to normal paint, that paint now is only showing up on the bit that I want it to show up, that main panel. And we can look at the mask. That's what the mask looks like. This is how you build up lots and lots of complicated materials. I'm going to quickly rush through doing this bit, these two bits, and this bit now. So I'm going to use a smart material to do these bits to speed it up. So smart materials are a combination of normal materials and smart masks all packaged together in one convenient little folder package. They're very, very useful for quickly doing stuff. So I'm going to apply steel gun because I think it's an awesome looking material. I'm just going to drag and drop that on top. It's going to overwrite everything like that. So straight away, I want to create a black mask, a paint, and I'm going to go back to my selection just here. I'm going to put mirror back on. I'm going to select the parts where I want this gun material to sort of play through. So I'm going to have this bit, I reckon. I'm going to zoom in and maybe this bit. Like that. And then the final one I'm going to do, I'm going to call this, I'm going to keep the name. I'm going to create one final material for this kind of bit just here. So I'm going to find something that contrasts nicely. Maybe this machinery, something. So you've got like greys and then some nice like accented kind of yellow bits. I'm going to drag and drop that to sit on top. So the whole object's going to become dirty yellow painted material. But again, I'm going to put a black mask on, add a paint, switch to my polygon fill mode, and I'm going to select all of these. Oh, I'm going to make sure that I've got symmetry on. That, and I'm probably going to have to tediously select some of these. And the same for the other side. Which I'm going to do super quick. Well, quicker anyway. Okay, and I've accidentally selected up here, so I've got to go down to nothing. Again, it's like a layer mask, and so if I paint that with black, then the yellow material will disappear. Okay, so switch that off. Got my high-tech looking panel, but I want to add just a couple more things, and I want to use this to show you painting with normal maps. I want to add a few more details. So on top of everything, I'm going to close all this so I can see my machinery, my steel gun, and my main panel. I'm going to create an empty, transparent layer. And you know what? The only thing I'm going to paint here is, oh, it's auto-saving. I'm going to leave it all on actually for the moment, but I'm only going to paint with normals at the moment. Down the bottom, normals are a bit like painting bumpiness. So in hard surfaces, again, Substance comes with a bunch of extremely useful things that you can use to add bumps and details. You know, and it's all geared towards this hard surface science fiction-y kind of look. So if I drag and drop one of these onto my normal, that's what I'm going to be painting with. So I'm going to paint a panel. I'm going to paint this panel here. I like the look of that. So if I drag and drop that onto my normal, actually I'm going to turn off color, height, rough, and metal. So I'm only painting with the normal map. And if I zoom in, you can see that. But it's got a soft edge. And the reason why it's got a soft edge is at the moment this brush has a soft alpha to define its shape. If I get rid of that, if I just go bye-bye, now I can see the whole panel and I can change the size of it. And these normal maps often come with little, they're semi-procedural, so you can change like the width of it by shrinking it down to get a thinner one. Or you can leave it at its default. Now, when you paint with a normal map, I'm going to paint in the orthographic view so I can get it dead on. It's going to be like painting bumpiness. So it's going to be like I'm stamping a shape into it. So if I go one click, like that, I can hold down Shift actually after making a click. That gives me a straight line so I can see, I can line it up. Click again. Or I could have used actually symmetry. Mirror would have done that too. So now I've painted in all this detail. You could have modeled that in CG, but I think you find and agree that it's a lot easier to just sort of stamp the shape back down onto it. I'm going to create a couple more little sort of bolts, I think. So I'm going to switch out my normal map here for one of these kind of screws. Maybe this one. I'm going to shrink it down because I don't want it to be super big. And you can make your brush bigger and smaller in exactly the same way that you do in Photoshop using the left and right square brackets. And now let's think about where these bolts should realistically go. Maybe put one there and one there. Actually, I'm going to switch symmetry on just to make it a bit easier. One there, see, automatically updates. And I'm thinking again, trying to think like a concept artist and thinking about details and the distribution of details. I don't want to scatter these bolts all over the place. I want them to be realistically positioned. But maybe every once in a while there's like two clustered together, maybe just here. There we go. So I'm going to add that on. Now you can add as much stuff as you want on. You can put vents on. You can theoretically make your own versions of these. But again, yeah, you know, think carefully about where you're going to put the stuff. You don't want to go over the top. Right, now these are stamped on. They look kind of cool. Let's switch symmetry off. But they do look a bit like, well, everything else has a kind of rough, worn look to it. In real life, if this was sort of modelled into it, it would be chipping away and peeling at certain points. I'm just going to actually rename this as details, normal details. What if I could use Substance's cleverness to make it know that there's going to be peeled paint and metal showing through just here? There's a number of ways to do that, but I'm going to show the easiest way. On your normal layer, so this is the layer that you've been using to add these little bolts and panels and stuff, you can go up to here, this little magic wand, and go add effect. And you can add a filter. And the filter by default is empty. And you click on the filter, and you've got this bunch of filters. You've got things like sharpening, blurring, and other stuff like that. Sharpening is actually really useful. But you've also got down here this magic one here called Matte Effects Detail Edgeware. If you click that, oh wow, look at that. It's kind of looked at the bumpiness, looked at your normal map, and tried to guess where paint would have been peeled away and metal would show through. And it's got a whole bunch of sliders here, so in real time you can decide exactly how worn you want it to be, how much grunge you want, how smooth you want it to be, or not smooth. It's super, super nice. Doing this back in the olden days with just Photoshop on its own would have been a nightmare. So, and now anything I add in to this normal layer will get that kind of worn, peeled away stuff. So in real time I can sort of add, if I added in a vent capsule, maybe I'm going to add that at the top here, just on one side. So that gets added in. So it looks bumpy, and it also gets that nice kind of metal worn away look to it. Right, so there we go. You've got an object that looks like it's got multiple different materials on it, and in a way, in Substance, it does. But we can get all of that rich information into just single texture maps that will then drive it in Maya. So I'm just going to run through that process again before we run out of time. So File, Export Textures. I don't want all of this. I want that version I made myself last week that only has base color, metal, roughness, and normal. Remember, if you want to make that, it's in configuration, and it's super important that you copy the Arnold 5 one by right mouse button, clicking duplicate, and then you can get rid of the stuff you don't need. So you don't need emissive, you don't need height. All we need is base color, metalness, roughness. Again, super important. Make sure you save those textures into the Maya project, into source images just here. Select folder. Now you can make them higher resolution if you wanted to. I'll keep them as 1024 and then just go export. It's that quick, super, super quick. Open folder to check that they are actually there. Yep, and I can see wall panel Lambert. So let's go back into Maya and attach these things as quick as we can. So I'm going to apply a new shader, a new material. So I'm right mouse button, go down to the bottom and go new material. Click on Arnold, and it's very important that we have a standard surface. And let's call this wall panel matte. Remember, we want this at 1, and we want color, file, and whereabouts has it hidden? Oh no, there it is. I'm going to go to there, and we want wall panel base color, open. We can put on view textures. Instantly we can see that it's kind of working. Remember, for the color we don't have to change anything, thankfully, so you just select that color and it's done. Let's bring up the hypershade to do the rest. So the hypershade lets us see our materials in more detail. It's that little weird little ball just here. Wall panel, click these two buttons to show us our material. So now I'm going to go through, I'm going to go metalness. Click that checkerboard, file, little folder icon, and now I want the metalness. And it's going to be pure black and white. But I do need to change this from sRGB to raw. And I need to click that little button and say alpha is luminance. I'm going to click back onto my main material. This time I'm going down to roughness. So I skip weight, skip color, straight to roughness. File, folder icon. I want my roughness. Click that. Again, alpha is luminance. And make sure it's raw. And the final thing is to get that bump information on. So this time though, I have to go into my hypershade, click anywhere in an empty space, and click the tab button, and then start typing bump. And it's bump 2D. Connect up, out normal to normal camera. Change user's bump to user's tangent space normals. And then it's the bump value checkerboard thing you've got to click. And another file, and then the folder, and then the normal. And then make sure this is set to raw as well. It would have automatically have put alpha as luminance on for you, so don't worry about that. But now you do have to go back into the bump 2D, and you do have to click that little button again, and you do have to go down to Arnold and click off, like this. And that's your material done. Material's onto here. Let's make it look a bit more interesting by getting in a light. So I'm just clicking on this area light in Arnold. I'm going to move this up. So this is a little light here. Some of you have messed around with lights before. I'm going to increase the size of it, rotate it around. I'm actually going to change the look of it so it looks more like maybe like a strip light, like a fluorescent light. And I want to see the effects of lighting, so I'm going to click that on. I can see it's way too dark at the moment. So I want that to be a higher number. Let's try 5 maybe. Click that. Let's try changing the position. What does this look like in Arnold? Oh, I'm going to get rid of the sky dome now, because I don't want the sky dome anymore. Okay, it's still way too dark. So let's go something much higher. Well, not too much higher actually, because this exposure is quite sensitive. It's brighter. Let's go to 10. Like that. You can see all the details coming out. See that nice sense of surface going on. Let's put it as 12. Okay. So now what I could do now, if I was doing the Mars interior project, I could select the light and the wall panel, and I could group them together by doing Control G. By default, that group's pivot point is in the center, so I just want to move that to the edge. So I'm going to hit Insert, hold down V, turn symmetry off, hold down V, and then I can snap that to that far edge just there and hit, not edge, sorry, vertex, and hit Insert again. Now I could select this group, duplicate it, and shift it along, holding V actually, to snap it just there. I could do the same thing again. I'm going to duplicate it again, hold down V, and snap it. Now I can just hit Shift D a whole bunch of times. Oh, and it hasn't moved it properly that time. Hold on. There we go. You can quickly build up a corridor. And then what you could do, you could select all those groups. You could group those. So you've got groups within groups. You could duplicate that group and then rotate it around. And you've got yourself a kind of science fiction-y corridor going on. I haven't put a ground in at the moment. Actually, I'll just quickly do that by doing just a plane, I reckon. Just a really, really big plane. Let's make this 3 by 3, like that. And I'm just going to give this just a plain Arnold material with just a grey kind of shader. But not, well, quite rough. And quite dark. I don't want it to be white. So then when you do a render, you get something that looks a bit like that. And I can switch on actually 3D manipulation here, which will allow me to have a look at my corridor. Anyway, so there you go. That's how you create a whole bunch of materials in Substance. So this is driven, the whole thing is just driven by 4 texture maps. And yet I get combinations of metal, paint, kind of concrete, all this kind of stuff, dust, all adding in there. What I want you to take away from this is this workflow, this kind of slow but steady, methodical workflow of building up your materials bit by bit. And if you do that, then you're going to end up with a much more interesting looking CGI project. Okay, cool. So let's stop recording.